What does the Bible say about the regulative principle of worship? Now, you may be wondering, what is the regulative principle of worship? It can sound like a very difficult concept. It sounds like it's using big theological language, technical terms, that sort of thing. But it's actually quite a simple thing to define. And the concept is very easy to understand. The idea is simply this. According to the regulative principle of worship, in worship, we can only do the things which God has commanded. We can only do the things which God has commanded. So this is probably the most foundational question that can be asked with regard to worship itself. What does the Bible say about the regulative principle of worship? Is this a biblical concept? Now, the opposite, and this will help us to understand more about what the regulative principle is, the other view, so to speak, is the normative principle of worship. So according to the normative principle of worship, this would be within Protestantism generally, according to the normative view, we must do the things which God has commanded. We can't do the things which God has prohibited. But there is a third category, so to speak. There are some things that God has not commanded, but that he's also not prohibited, that the Bible just simply doesn't speak to. And those things are allowed. That is what the normative principle of worship teaches. That's the other view, so to speak. So according to the regulative principle, it's not just that we must do the things which God has commanded. It is also the case that we cannot do anything else, that we can't do anything else in worship except the things which God has commanded. And so what does the Bible teach about this? Is there this third category? And what I'm going to argue here is that the Bible does in fact teach the regulative principle of worship. And part of the reason for this is because when those who argue for the normative principle speak of things that God has not prohibited and that God has not commanded, that category is actually non-existent. That there is nothing that God has not commanded that he's also not prohibited. The things which God has commanded are one thing, and basically everything else has been prohibited. So there's only really two categories. And if this is the case, then of course, the things in worship that we must do are the things which he has commanded. Now, you may be wondering how this could possibly be the case. How could it be the case that I could say that everything that's not commanded is prohibited, that there's no third category of things that are not commanded but also not prohibited? It would seem like the Bible does not actually speak to everything. Does the Bible really speak to some of the modern practices of worship? Does it really speak to having a play as part of worship, that sort of thing? Does the Bible speak to these various things? And you may be tempted to say, well, no, the Bible doesn't speak to them because obviously these things are beyond the time of the Bible, and therefore it just doesn't speak to these things with that sort of specificity. And while it may be true, I will grant that things like whether or not plays should be included in the worship service are not directly addressed in the scriptures. The scriptures still do prohibit it. They do prohibit it by what it actually says is prohibited. And the reason why I can say this is because ultimately, and this comes out of our understanding of the second commandment, which we'll dive into in a minute. Ultimately, there are really only two sources for knowing how to worship God. You can either worship God in the way in which God commands, or you can worship God in a way that comes from the mind of men. You can either get your methods of worship from God or from men. There's no other category. And what I'm saying is that the scriptures condemn as idolatry anything that comes from the mind of men when it comes to worship. So in terms of these two things, there is obedience to God and his commands, or there is acquiescing to the thoughts of man. And that second one is always idolatry. Any kind of worship practice that comes from the mind of man is in fact condemned. It is not according to the scriptures because it does come from the mind of men. And this is even what makes it an idol. An idol is not an idol so much because of its physicality. It is rather that it comes from man itself. That is to say that the source of how you worship God cannot come from man. Whether it be man making a physical idol or man coming up with his own ideas, imaginations about things to do, to act out, for instance, artwork or whatever, any kind of thing that is used for worship that comes from the mind of men is categorically the same as idolatry. The thing that relates to both of them is that it comes from man rather than God. And this is why, for instance, in Colossians chapter 2, the Apostle Paul condemns all will worship. The idea is a worship that comes from the will of men rather than from obedience to God. Now, as I've mentioned, all this comes from the second commandment. You remember that the second commandment is distinguished from the first commandment. The first commandment, and we're talking about the 10 commandments, the first commandment is you shall have no other gods before you. You shall have no other gods before me. And the emphasis of the first commandment is who you worship. You are to worship the one true God. The second commandment is related but distinct. The second commandment is about how you worship the one true God, or how you worship God in general. So there you're talking about the method of worship. And the point of the second commandment is to say that you are not allowed to worship the one true God via idols. That is not a proper method for worshiping God. Now, if you were to ask what is the proper method, the opposite is given, which is obedience to the commandments of God. Now, where I get this understanding of the second commandment in particular with regard to the opposite of idolatry being obedience to God's commandments, which would, I think, prove very clearly the regulative principle of worship, that comes from the end of Deuteronomy chapter 12. And this is a very important text, probably the most important text in the Bible for establishing the regulative principle of worship. At the end of Deuteronomy chapter 12, Moses speaks of the people of God as they're going to come into the land, and they're going to see all these different ways in which all of the nations all around them worship their gods. And what Moses says is, when you look and you see all these different methods of how they worship their gods, you are not to worship the Lord your God in that way. That is to say, notice, there is not so much an issue of the first commandment, but a second commandment issue. You are not to worship the one true God, having the right God and worshiping him, in a method that is like the gods, the nations all around them, in the way that they worship their gods. So Moses has in view here the proper method of worship. You are not to take from the methods of the peoples all around you and use them to worship the one true God. So there it seems like every method is being condemned. Every method that comes from these other nations are condemned, all of it, because if it comes from the mind of men, then it is idolatry. Now Moses, importantly, ends the passage in verse 32 by saying what you are to do. And what you are to do is obey the voice of the Lord your God. You are to obey God. So the opposite of idolatry at the end of Deuteronomy chapter 12 is obedience to God. So there is, on the one hand, worshiping God according to the methods of the nations. On the other hand, there is worshiping God according to his own commandments. And so this would prohibit everything else that's not commanded by God. If you are to be obedient to God with regard to how you worship him, you are to worship by worshiping according to the word of God. You are to apply, as this doctrine came out, the regular principle of worship, the doctrine came out of the Reformation, is essentially an application of the principle of sola scriptura to the area of worship. The Bible and the Bible alone is to govern the way in which God is worshipped. Now, there's another important point as we consider Deuteronomy chapter 12, and that is that if you notice in the passage, the great temptation for the people of God is that they would use the methods of the nations all around them. It wasn't just some random ideas that they would think of, but it's that they would incorporate the things that they see the nations doing in the worship of their God. And this is something that's quite parallel to what is happening today. And this is the reason why it is incredibly applicable and why the regulative principle is still in force and why it does, in fact, prohibit every idea that comes from the mind of men. Because the temptation is that they would take from these methods from these other nations and they would use it in the worship of the one true God. And this is always the temptation for the people of God, that they would take the ideas that come from the world about how to be influential, about how to garner support from others, about how to do things that are flashy, that sort of thing, anything that is influential in any way. There's always going to be a temptation to use those things that the world says are important in the worship of God. And this is in fact what we see in some of the practices of the modern worship movement, sort of like the contemporary worship scene. There is this desire to pattern worship off of things that are highly influential in the world. And that is essentially the same temptation of the people of God in the days of Moses, that they would look around, they would see the things that others are doing, and that they would incorporate those things into the worship of God. The scriptures rather say, though, according to the regulative principle, that you are rather to worship the Lord your God in the way in which he has commanded you, which means fundamentally that there is to be continuity between the worship practices that we have now and those which are practiced even in the first century. There's to be fundamental continuity between all of those things. And so the scriptures do in fact teach that the Bible is to regulate worship. The regulative principle of worship is in fact a biblical doctrine. We're going to address some objections to this in part 2 and hammer out some of the details. But overall, the idea is that according to the scriptures and in applying the doctrine of sola scriptura, that you are to worship the Lord your God in the way in which he has commanded you.